I will not rest till all who threaten Yvresse are buried.
He is vengeance! He is the Knight! He is Batman! He also has the unholy union of Superman and Geralt of Rivia by his side. It takes a special kind of crazy to invade the Badlands, but Eltharion is the level of crazy, and he hates the Greenskins so much that wants to kill them. All of them!
Welcome everyone, Costin here with my campaign overview guide for Eltharion the Grim in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Eltharion is certainly one of the stronger legendary lords in the game. He's got good effects, he's got a strong army, possibly one of the strongest armies in the game, or at least certainly the strongest army for the High Elves. Like, Eltharion has better campaign mechanics that helps him get better situations for his battles, but the army that Eltharion has is on a completely different level because he can get unique units that only he has access to and only if you're playing him. And there is a great deal of power with those units because they are pretty powerful to begin with and you can make them even more so. Now let's talk a bit about faction effects. So you have access to the dungeons of Athel Tamara. You can spread the Mist of Yvresse, cloaking Eltharion and his allies in lands in a defensive shroud. Now, what the Mist does, you're basically going to be looking at gaining army abilities. Summon the Sentinels, summon a unit, and does some damage. And you can also increase and replenish ammunition. You can increase the power of units and replenish their ammunition, the range power of units. And you also get recruit rank +3 for spear infantry and ranger units. So you can get some fairly high ranking spearmen and silvering guard. Now, Eltharion himself, when we're looking at the special skill line, it may not seem necessarily that special, but it's certainly a skill line that does give significant power to his army. When we're looking at it, he gains campaign movement range, he gets power in battle, armor for shielded units, so spearmen are going to have quite a bit of armor, grim discipline, so he is a very powerful lord when it comes to battles, and he also gains an enormous amount of power to Mistwalker units. Those Mistwalker units are the special units that I have mentioned. And that's just only part of his faction mechanics. One of the more powerful ones is the prison over here. So you get a combat ability to use the prison in combat, and that will stun a legendary lord or a lord and apply a significant debuff to them for that duration. The point is to try and capture them so you can unlock various effects. Now these effects will grant you various various benefits to your units. Like you can increase the army capacity for those special units, and you can get benefits to those units as well. But on top of that, you can also interrogate lords that you've captured for even more faction benefits. Like you can capture a lord, then release him for a faction, and then he'll give you a certain amount of income. You also have an influence bonus because of that. Now, when we're looking at Eltharion's campaign situation, his victory conditions require him to basically wipe out all the factions, all the bad factions in the balance and nearby. So you have to wipe out Queek, you have to wipe out Skaven, Blight, Grom. Though Grom is not necessarily a priority, like other factions will deal with Grom. And you do have to upgrade all of the facilities, though that's not really going to be too much of a major issue to achieve these kind of victory conditions. Now, I'm thankful that they did change Eltharion's campaign victory conditions, because I believe originally when Immortal Empires came out, he had to basically go after Dark Elves, and that's not really what he should be about. By the way, on top of that, he's immune to Barren Wasteland attrition. He gets benefits to Spear Infantry, Ranger units, so he can have a very sturdy front line with the High Elves. Like the High Elven game plan, if I go over here to Tower of Yvresse, the High Elven game plan is to get the sturdy melee line of either Spearmen or Silvering Guard, or some other units, of course, as well, like some other units that you can recruit, some other melee units that you can get access to. But the point is, get that solid infantry line, take advantage of that infantry line, and hold your ground. Like and then kill the enemy with ranged units. So you have significant benefits when it comes to your melee line. Eltharion has benefits to its range power. You have more benefits to melee units. Now, another thing to mention about Eltharion is you do start with 2 armies. And generally speaking, the initial campaign battle, every faction has 1 initial campaign battle. You have 2 battles, 2 different battles, like the settlement that you start next to with Eltharion, and then of course this army over here and the settlement garrison over here that you can take out turn 1. Now, I'm just gonna set the battle difficulty to easy. Just take out this army, which you should do turn 1, regardless of whatever else you decide to do in your campaign. You should do it. Now, once you've gone and done this, you have a choice. You can either attack the settlement and take it over. You should have enough troops, if you play your cards correctly, you should have enough troops to be able to deal with the garrison, though it might be a bit of a bloody battle. Whenever you capture your first settlement, you will be given a choice in your campaign. You can either gain 25,000 gold, get the Brave New World faction benefit for 50 growth to all province. So whatever territory you're going to take from now on, you're going to be able to grow very, very quickly. Or you can maintain control of Evres, get home defense, which is 5 control, and gain 120 influence. Now, given your campaign victory conditions, the things you need to do, as well as the situation in Wolf 1, I would argue that giving Tor Evres for 25,000 gold is probably the better choice, at least if you're going to focus on the balance. But you could try and do both of these things. Like, you can try and maintain control over your territory, build up, get the significant growth for the livestock pens, get more units here to fight the greenskins that are in southern Evres. But that is going to present certain challenges in your campaign. It's probably the harder thing to do, to be quite honest with you. But you can do it and you can win this fight, but it's not necessarily going to be very fast. And then you can take your army here and start conquering the Badlands. You'll be slower at conquering the Badlands as a result of this, but you will have 2 different territories. Like, it's probably the harder start, but long-term potential is greater. Or you can choose the easier start, which I'm personally a fan of, because generally speaking in Warhammer campaigns, it's really the early game that's the hardest part, not the mid game, not the late game. Just take over this territory, hold on to this territory. Now, another thing you can do, one thing to be mindful of, though, is whichever territory you take first is going to be the one that gives you the option. And if you do decide to give up Tor of Rest, you're going to get a peace agreement, an automatic peace agreement with these greenskins. So say for instance, you've won the battle here, your army is in this region, so it won't be disbanded if you give up Tor of Rest. Tyrion will take Tor of Rest, by the way. So it won't automatically be disbanded if you do give up Tor of Rest. Like, if this army is in the Tor of Rest region, it's going to be disbanded. That would not be a great situation, regardless of what you end up choosing to do. I mean, there's a decent unit over here with the Spire Guard. There's some Eltharion Reavers. Like, it's a decent enough starting army in its own right. But this is certainly the harder campaign start. But having 120 influence can really help you out, because you can then use that influence for the sake of, you know, getting a lord with some really sweet effects, like for instance getting a prince with efficient, which from turn 1, which could give you a massive upkeep benefit for your archer, spearman, silver guard, lauder, and sea guard. In fact, I might be tempted to take this prince and replace her with him. Now, the benefit of the growth, though, is it will help you improve, it will help you get this entire province of the Southern Badlands to a fairly high level pretty quickly. So those are your 2 choices when it comes to the campaign. One's harder than the other early game, the other one but gives you more gives you more benefits. The other is easier early game, but a bit harder late game because it's going to be harder to confederate with Ulfon. But regardless of what to choose, one significant benefit to your campaign is that you will have the ability of getting those trade agreements, getting pretty much a lot of agreements early on with Ulfon. And if you give, by the way, Tower of Rest to Tyrion while taking over the settlement, for instance, then you'll be able to trade with Tyrion as well. Now, with that in mind, in Ulfon itself, you don't really have a major threat with the exception of Nakari, but she would have Nakari would have to take over take over Crix, take over Katik, and then march on Tower of Rest. So you're relatively safe, and Nakari's army is not necessarily the strongest. So I'm going to focus on the Badlands situation, because this is a campaign where if you need to win, or if you want to win and get those campaign victory conditions for the hero capacity or hero recruit rank, you're going to need to take over the Badlands, like basically all of it. Now, in the Badlands, you do have the Savage Orcs that you start at war with, but to the north, you have a major problem in Warzag, the Great Green Prophet. Now, Warzag starts with 9 units. He has a pretty powerful army, and he himself is a powerful magic lord. And he also is a Greenskin faction, so he's going to throw numerous armies against you. One of the things you could do is decide, well, let's try and wipe him out quickly. But that might be a bit harder said than done. In fact, the best thing you could probably do in your campaign is take the entirety of the Southern Badlands, especially if you give up Tower of Reska. You're going to have high growth, and you can get the settlement to tier 3 very quickly. And there's a special structure over here in Galbaraz that will give you significant benefits to your campaign. And after that, what should you do? Well, you could take the entirety of the barrier idols to involve yourself in a fight against Scarbrand. Now, doing so comes with its pros and cons. On one hand, fighting Scarbrand is certainly doable, but on the other hand, you're going to expose your territory to Malagor, and you're going to expose your territory to Quake, while at the same time, Warzag is going to come for you. Probably a better plan might be to just take this entire province and then go after Malagor, or get directly after Warzag. Though just bear in mind, the fight against Warzag is going to be difficult unless you can isolate his armies one at a time. But probably wiping out Warzag and taking this entire province for yourself is really your best bet. The border princes to the west, Belagar, and Belagar are not unfriendly towards you. In fact, quite the opposite. You might be able to maintain good relations with them. Like, for instance, like with the Western Border Princes, you can possibly get the trade agreement, like from turn 1, very easily, and improve relations with them. And by the way, if you have good relations with the Border Princes, then Belagar is also going to like you because he has good relations with them, though that might put you in a war with Sartosa. Though, to be quite blunt about it, your army annihilates Sartosas in any stand-up fight, so you shouldn't be worried. One thing to mention is, the High Elves, even with Eltharion's melee benefits, they're a range faction. They rely on the range power of their units. And the thing about Warzag, Sartosa, the Skaven, and even Scarbrand to an extent, depends on the units you're talking about, but many of the factions that surround them, be it, Scrag, Sartosa, Warzag, they're factions that have units with relatively low armor. Guess what those are vulnerable against? They're vulnerable against the range power that you do have. So you can easily wipe these factions out. Now, I would not necessarily go for to wipe out Sartosa. In fact, if you could avoid a war with Sartosa and avoid having to devote those resources, that would be better, the best, because you can't really take territory here because it is unpleasant. Though, funnily enough, you can and should, at one point, take over Skavenblight. Now, the AI has a difficult time actually assaulting Skavenblight. Belagar tends to dominate this entire section of the map. Like, I've never seen Belagar completely wiped out by any of the factions he shares a border with. And although I've never really seen him take out Ekeclaw, or at least not doing it so easily, it might take a very long campaign for him to do so. So you might want to take Skavenblight, and then just wipe out Mogr, and then this entire section of the map will be secure. You could settle it yourself if you have the money and you're willing to pay the price for it, or you could just let Belagar or Batonia do so and maintain good relations with them. Your focus should be to expand across the Badlands, and you want to eventually wipe out. You want to eventually take over the entirety of the Badlands. Take out the Mutinous Gets, take out quick. Though, bear in mind something important here. You can take over the wasteland, but you can't take over the mountains. Or, well, you can, but it's not really beneficial for you to do so. So you might want to trade some of this territory with the other factions. You probably could go for a campaign plan where you meet Emmerich and eventually confederate Emmerich, because Emmerich is an absolute beast in battle, so being able to confederate him would give you a significant amount of campaign power. Though whether or not you want to fight the campaign in the Darklands, that is a different discussion. The Darklands aren't really great. An alternative, though, would be to eventually head over back to Ulthuan. Like, let's say, right, you fight your early game in the Badlands, you take it over, you make deals with dwarves, the border prince and all that. So your in Khemri, so your borders, all of them will be secure. You take over this entire territory, right? Maybe you give the barrier idols to Thoric or something like that. But you can secure this as the starting area of your campaign and then head over back to Ulthuan because it's suitable climate. The problem Eltharion has is, like, he doesn't really have a lot of suitable climate in his campaign. Like, yes, he has Ulthuan, he has frozen territory, and he has the wasteland, but outside of that, he doesn't really have all that much suitable territory for himself. So you can either fight the campaign in an unsuitable or an unpleasant climate, or you can head back over to Ulthuan from, after dealing with Skaven, like just moving your armies through Estalia, going back to Ulthuan, going back home and expanding your campaign through there. I'd say this is probably the biggest problem of the campaign. Like, I like Eltharion as a character. I think he's very interesting. I like his campaign mechanics. What I dislike is the limitations of the campaign when it comes to territory. I think his campaign would be a lot better if you could take over temperate climate. Or even mountains, really, but I don't know if I would want to fight the campaign against dwarves as the High Elves. But I think if you could just take over temperate climate, that would make your campaign just a lot better overall. You could take over a lot more territory. You would have a reason to take over Sylvania, end up in the fight with Chaos. But as it stands, you're kind of going to be pushed into expanding into Nagorond, taking over Dark Elven territory and getting involved in that mess over there. Or the alternative is to fight over territory that's not going to be that great. Like, eventually you could go back for the temperate climate over here once you have an even stronger economy. This is what I mean by the early game with Tor of Rest, with keeping Tor of Rest being harder but potentially better in the long term. Because if you hold Tor of Rest, you can take over the entirety of the southern Evres and then expand from there. Or you could just give Tor of Rest, get an army here, take this settlement, make this your capital, and eventually, eventually after 10 turns, because you don't want that diplomatic penalty, eventually just go after these greenskins and then expand. Though it's not necessarily a great campaign plan, there's issues. Though, notably, you are one of the few factions that can actually take over, or I think the only High Elven faction, with the exception of Emmerich, who can actually take over the entirety of Ulthuan and have its suitable climate, because Nagaraith is wasteland due to the historical situation over there. And that's really all there is to say with Eltharion. I think it's certainly a different campaign than any other High Elven Legendary Lord, with the exception of Emmerich. But there are certainly issues in the campaign as well. Though it's certainly much more playable and a lot less frustrating than the nonsense that Emmerich has to deal with. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.